When it comes to our health, every day we can choose to be a warrior or a victim. Welcome to Freedom Alive. Dr. Robert Malone is the original inventor of the mRNA platform as a technology, among other patents in the fields of gene delivery and vaccines. Yet when Dr. Malone started speaking out about the safety issues of the COVID shots and early treatment for COVID-19, government, media, and big tech have done everything in their power to censor and threaten him. We're honored that Dr. Malone joins us to share what is really happening behind the medical curtain. I'm blessed to again be joined by our co-host, Matt Staver from Liberty Counsel. And Matt, it has become very clear that many medical professionals think they're all-knowing and cannot be questioned. Yet there is often a different agenda going on behind the scenes.
Well, we've seen that especially from COVID, where we saw this different agenda. And I think a lot of people's eyes were opened as a result of COVID. A lot of people changed their doctors because their doctors were not following scientific advice. They were following the media mantra and that which was promoted by the Centers for Disease Control, NIH, Dr. Fauci, the FDA, that the COVID shots were safe and effective, and they knew, frankly, that they were not safe nor effective. And unfortunately, even today, a lot of people are still suffering from those shots, and many people have died as a result of those shots. People like Dr. Robert Malone was, prior to COVID, the inventor of the mRNA platform as a technology that was actually used for this new experimental treatment for COVID, and that was these COVID shots.
We are delighted to bring Dr. Malone back as a guest on Freedom Alive. We cannot wait to bring this episode to you, but our Freedom Alert is next, and our Freedom Alert is brought to you by Liberty Counsel.
This could be pivotal for the High Court. Liberty Counsel has asked the U.S. Supreme Court to review the Kim Davis case. This former Rowan County, Kentucky clerk was sued for not signing a so-called same-sex marriage license. And this case underscores why a Obergefell must be overturned. The High Court abused its duty to interpret the Constitution and invented a so-called right to same-sex marriage. In the 2015 opinion, Chief Justice John Roberts wrote, quote, "5 lawyers have closed the debate and enacted their own vision of marriage as a matter of constitutional law. The majority's decision is an act of will, not legal judgment. The right it announces has no basis in the Constitution or this court's precedent," close quote. This horrible opinion threatens the religious liberty of Americans who believe in biblical marriage.
Up next, Matt's interview with Dr. Robert Malone.
It's my pleasure to welcome back to Freedom Alive a special guest, Dr. Robert Malone. He is the co-chair of the CDC Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, the founder and president of Malone Institute, and many other things as well that we'll talk about as we go through our interview with Dr. Malone. Also, the inventor of the mRNA platform technology. Dr. Malone, welcome to Freedom Alive. You have a lot of patents on your wall, and I guess that's just a sample of some of the patents that you have done throughout your medical and scientific career.
Yes, thanks. Peter McCullough long ago said to me that I needed to put up more things to establish credibility, like my diplomas. So that was the start of all that.
Well, it's amazing because COVID really opened our eyes to a lot of things. Obviously, you are the inventor of the mRNA platform that later was used by Pfizer and Moderna to create the COVID shots. And then you began to raise questions about the COVID shot itself using the platform by way of how the COVID shot was impacting individuals. And when you raised questions from a scientific standpoint, all of a sudden, people started to attack you. It's amazing that they would attack somebody like yourself with the kind of credentials that you have, but I think it really underscores this big pharma mentality that you and others have gone up against. Dr. Malone, thank you for joining us. I want to go into your work right now, particularly with vaccines. You are the co-chair of the Make America, you're a medical advisor of the Make America Healthy Again. You're the co-chair of the CDC Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. What are some of the issues that you're finding working in that particular role with what you have seen happen there, and what's the path forward?
Well, it goes from the profound to the mundane. There's obviously a issue with the bureaucracy at the CDC, and that's partially been worked through due to Secretary Kennedy's asking for the resignation of the recently appointed director, Susan Menares, who turned out to be very much invested in the current status quo. The CDC in general has become very focused on issues of equity, basically DEI, as well as accessibility of medicines, and in particular vaccines. They're really kind of obsessive about the idea that all vaccines are safe and effective, and they won't really tolerate any criticism of that, let's say, narrative. And that has been at the core of it. That's not scientific. That's a cult. And we really have had a vaccine cult in the CDC and across, NIAID under Tony Fauci. And of course, we see it out in industry and academia, this idea that you cannot question whether or not vaccines are safe and effective is non-scientific. Another core issue is the tension that exists between public health and physician practice, traditional physician practice. Now, all the docs that are coming offline right now out of the medical schools are being trained exclusively on protocols. What they're being trained and tested on is whether or not they can identify the right protocol for a syndrome or a disease, not on how to treat the disease or the underlying pharmacology or the underlying mechanisms of that disease or the diagnosis, but whether they can identify the right protocol. So medicine as it was practiced when I was trained is very different from what's happening now. But over all of this is the logic of modern public health. And just if your listeners aren't familiar with that, there's been a sea change in bioethics between the 20th and 21st century. In the 20th century, medical bioethics were grounded in the Nuremberg Code, the Hippocratic Oath, Helsinki Accord, Belmont Report, these fundamentals that are structured around the thesis that the patient has the right to informed consent. And in the world of public health, the core moral principle is a utilitarian version of that is now called utilitarian bioethics. It's swept academia in the era of DEI and wokeism, and it's now kind of the dominant structure under which a lot of decisions are being made. The idea behind utilitarian bioethics is not to put the patient at the center of things, but rather the idea that it's the responsibility of the state and the system to work towards the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And of course, that all boils down to who gets to define happiness and how do you measure happiness. It's very subjective. And so the CDC and the ACIP have traditionally been grounded in this idea of utilitarian greatest good or greatest happiness for the greatest number. And that doesn't live happily in the same space of focusing on the patient in front of you and what is best for them, individual medicine, focused medicine. And so this is a fundamental tension right now in the CDC and the ACIP. Who are we really advising? In addition to the director of the CDC, are we advising from the perspective of public health and utilitarianism? Or are we advising from the perspective of the practicing physician? What should the practicing physician be doing as it relates to vaccines and related products? So there's an overview, and from that, everything else flows. The issues of revisiting the childhood vaccine schedule, when to start the first hepatitis B dose, the ideas around informed consent for the COVID vaccines, all of that flows from those core issues.
So really the two different worldviews, I guess, or approaches would be looking at informed consent from the patient and the doctor relationship, what's best for that individual situation, versus this global type of look that it's going to be a top-down public health template or pattern that's going to be superimposed to reach an objective, irrespective of what the doctor thinks or what the patient needs.
Yeah, and the top-down is grounded functionally in socialism. This is what we're seeing is socialized medicine and the logic around socialized medicine, which is to optimize the greatest good for the greatest number. And this flows, if you want a modern example of where this goes, look at Canada with the medical assistance in dying, where the state is now sponsoring suicide for virtually any reason.
Now, I was watching a colloquy between Senator Rand Paul and the former CDC director that was fired, pushed out, let go. And he was asking her a very simple question, very straightforward, how she could justify vaccinating a newborn baby with the hepatitis B vaccine when the mother is not Hep B positive. Very simple response to that. How can you justify that? And she would not answer that question. But in light of what you said about these two different approaches, it makes a lot of sense. She can answer that question because she doesn't want to answer it from a scientific standpoint because it goes against her narrative. She wants to put a template across everyone and force everyone against their will, no matter whether it's good for them or not.
So in that specific case, what it boils down to, and this is acknowledged, but quietly, it's not really allowed to be presented as a narrative in media. But what's going on behind this with the hepatitis B controversy for the third dose is the logic that if the medical system doesn't administer hepatitis B vaccination at birth, it becomes very hard to get them, that's their words, at the time when hepatitis B is actually a significant risk. But how does hepatitis B end up infecting a newborn? Well, it either happens because mom has Hep B, and that's easy to test for. And it's actually, there's universal testing now in the United States for Hep B in moms at time of birth, if not sooner. Or you can get it from the family and surroundings. So when you get it from the family and surroundings, you have to be with a family or a group that has a high incidence of hepatitis B or high risk. What's those groups? It's not you and me, okay? The historic context for all of this is that after the Vietnam War, there was a large number of Southeast Asian immigrants back to the United States. You remember we took in those people that had, many of them that had assisted the United States during this Vietnam War. Those people had a very high incidence of hepatitis B, and they would transfer it to their children. And so we had a surge of hepatitis B right after the Vietnam War when these people were brought into the United States. But when the likes of the CDC folks show us the graph of the incidence of hepatitis B, where it used to be really high and now it's really low, they cut out the part before the Vietnam War surge of Southeast Asian immigrants. So it looks like it was really high and then it's dropped because of the vaccine ostensibly. No, what really happened was it was really high because we had a surge of Vietnamese and other Southeast Asians coming into the United States where hepatitis B is endemic. So it's kind of a sleight of hand, but the vaccine industry in those that are associated with it, including the medical infrastructure and the pediatric societies, which, by the way, they all make money off of this. They became very invested in the idea that you have to get them with the vaccine at birth because you can't readily get them later on.
Well, in fact, this is a real concern about the control and the interaction between big pharma and these alphabet agencies, CDC, FDA, NIH. It seems to be a revolving door back and forth. I know RFK Jr. wrote a book about that, and there's been a lot of research on it. With regards to the childhood vaccination schedule, it seems like with big pharma, pharmaceutical companies having absolute liability immunity for any kind of injury or death that they cause by a vaccine. Now they have this huge market where they can lobby to get more and more vaccines on the schedule, and they have this built-in market of people that will get these vaccines because they have to go to school. They have to go to daycare and so forth, so that becomes a mandatory thing for them to exist in their states. What are you doing, and what has happened already regarding the vaccine schedule recommendations for children?
Okay, I'm going to give the obligatory caveat here. I'm speaking about my own opinion, not about the U.S. government, the CDC, or ACIP, and not representing them. So what has been done at the ACIP to date is that we almost achieved a change in the hepatitis B schedule. We dropped the V part of MMRV. This is the childhood vaccine product. And so we split that off now. We are actively examining the entire vaccine schedule. And there's separate initiatives in the government right now to actively look at what the evidence is for co-administration of all these products, particularly in children. So without sharing confidential information from within the government, you can please be assured that the issue of the childhood vaccine schedule is a high priority within the administration. That high priority comes from very high up in the administration. That's a code word. So
there was a hearing before Senator Ron Johnson, and there was a study that was discussed with regards to evaluating youth, children, vaccinated and unvaccinated, and it looked at the different kinds of incidences of diseases, and in certain categories there was no comparative diseases in the unvaccinated versus the vaccinated. Going forward, what do you see as it relates to science and research, particularly from the federal agencies that you're a part of and sponsoring, more research into the consequences of these childhood vaccines, especially in the relationship to autism?
So let's talk just for a moment about that Henry Ford study that Senator Johnson basically forced out into the open, because the people that ran the study had objectively designed it under the assumption that it would be clear that receiving these childhood vaccines resulted in better health outcomes overall. And to their surprise, when they ran the numbers, a very large study, what they found was that the unvaccinated children had better health outcomes. Bombshell. And the investigators were so afraid of publishing that in terms of the impact on their career that they held off publishing for years until Senator Johnson forced the issue out into the open and forced this study to be disclosed. Now you're talking, so that confirms, or it certainly supports, other studies that have been done that suggest the same thing. And there's a physician who had made this observation years back who lost his license for having made that observation. Turns out that it's true. Now, moving forward, you've mentioned the issue of autism. And as you could tell from the president's press conference, the president has a very personal interest in addressing autism spectrum disorders. He started off that press conference by saying that he had waited 20 years to have this conversation. And later on, he referred to having met with Bobby Kennedy 20 years ago. Now, why 20 years? Well, it turns out Barron Trump is about to turn 20. Barron Trump is a very intelligent young man, but there is a case to be made that he suffers from a form of the autism spectrum disorder type of damage. You know, people that are highly intelligent can basically mask or compensate for ASD symptoms, and that may be the case with Barron Trump. But in any case, it's a hot topic for the president. And so what you had with that announcement was that the government was officially acknowledging that there's at least one agent, that being acetaminophen, the marketed name being Tylenol, that is associated, the data suggest in multiple studies that it is associated with autism spectrum disorder and hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. If it is administered during pregnancy or early childhood. And the thing about that is the press ignores it, but there is a very well established mechanism of action of Tylenol. Tylenol will kill you in sufficient doses. It's used by people committing suicide, and it destroys your liver. In that case, it destroys your liver because the molecule glutathione is necessary to metabolize Tylenol. And if you take enough Tylenol, you deplete your glutathione levels, and then that sets off a biochemical cascade that results in basically destroying your liver. But in smaller doses, it can affect brain function, and particularly neurocognitive development. And that's well established in the literature, animal models, human studies, et cetera, et cetera. So that is one factor. And what you're touching on is, are there other factors associated with autism? Could one of those other factors be vaccination? Let's just touch on that for a moment. Vaccines are associated with they are formulated with adjuvants and other things which trigger inflammation. That's what they're designed to do. In many cases, the antigen, the protein or polysaccharide component of the vaccine, doesn't provoke a strong enough immune response unless you add an adjuvant. So adjuvant is defined basically as something that will cause you to have an inflammatory reaction when you co-administer it with a vaccine. Polly Matzinger calls this a danger signal. In any case, it sets off certain types of immune responses. But adjuvants can also trigger inflammation in various parts of your body. And in the case of multiple doses, it may have an effect on inflammation in the brain. Inflammation in the brain can cause swelling, all kinds of things. It can be associated in the child with seizures. And by the way, it is associated with elevated temperature. And so what do you do reflexively these days? What are moms taught? Yeah. If baby has an elevated temperature or mom has an elevated temperature, well, you pop Tylenol. You always treat the fever instead of thinking about what the underlying causes are. So it may be there's a link between vaccination and acetaminophen that is basically a consequence of how physicians are making recommendations and the overprescription of acetaminophen. But there may be other effects like adjuvant effects, aluminum effects, et cetera, et cetera. So still be determined. It's hard science to do that because it's large populations. And there's a lot of co-variables, other things that are going on that have to be accounted for, not the least of which is what's called healthy vaccinee bias. So it makes for some really hard epidemiology.
Well, Dr. Malone, I could talk with you all day. I know your schedule is exceptionally busy. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Alive. I am very excited, however, that there's change in the air, that people like you are part of that change. And I also think that we ought to very much encourage our members of Congress who are questioning RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr., because he is the man for the hour to be able to lead this with the Secretary of HHS and be able to bring people like yourself, real scientists who want to get to the bottom of these issues, on board to answer and address these critically important questions. Our guest is Dr. Robert Malone, and his website is on the screen, maloneinstitute.org, and the other website there as well, rwmalonemd.com. Dr. Malone, thank you for joining us on Freedom Alive.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you and your audience. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Matt, this interview is another reminder, like our recent episode with Dr. Stuart Tankersley, of just the threat that the Make America Healthy initiative represents to the status quo and big pharma in this country.
Yeah, which is why, again, I emphasize this in our interview with Dr. Stuart Tankersley. We need to support Robert F. Kennedy Jr. because there's a number of members of Congress who are receiving a lot of dollars from big pharma for their election campaigns. And they are the mouthpiece of big pharma, and they are attacking him. And they want to remove him because he represents a clear and present danger to the vaccine big pharma status as usual crowd. And without him there, it's status quo. He needs to be there. And he has people like Dr. Robert Malone that he is now appointed to these different committees on vaccines that he's bringing in. It's really, really important that we support him and make sure that our members of Congress know that we support and back RFK Jr.
No question. No question. As always, it's our honor to bring this information to you with Freedom Alive. In closing, remember Proverbs 2, verse 6, which says, "For the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth come knowledge and understanding." Our freedom is a gift from our Creator. We must never forget that and always protect it. Join us here next time. You'll hear victories as well as ways you can stand up for your priceless freedom. Join us again for Freedom Alive.